Okay, hey, we're back with Chapter 7, Commerce and Culture. And now we're going to look at Section 2, Sea Roads, Exchange Across the Indian Ocean. And keep in mind, as we study this chapter, we need to consider the significance of trade in human history and the interactions created by long-distance trade, especially during this period of third-wave civilizations, and examine the full range of what was carried along those trade routes: goods, culture, disease, which we discussed in Chapter 1, and the differences between the commerce of the Eastern Hemisphere and that of the Western Hemisphere, and the reasons behind those differences. So just keep that in mind as we continue on through this chapter of commerce and culture. Okay. Now, the Mediterranean Sea was an avenue for commerce from the time of the Phoenicians, and Venice was a center of commerce by 1000. They controlled the trade of imports from Asia and linked Europe to the much greater trade network of the Indian Ocean. Now, the Indian Ocean network was the world's most important trade network until 1500. Trade came from environmental and cultural diversity. Transportation was cheaper by sea than by land. And made the transportation of bulk goods possible, like textiles, pepper, timber, rice, sugar, and wheat are a few of the examples. And those items were shipped in bulk, in large, mass quantities. And commerce was possible thanks to the monsoons, and those are the alternating wind currents in the Indian Ocean. And commerce was conducted between towns, not states. Now, the Indian Ocean commerce started during the first civilizations. The Indus Valley writing was probably stimulated by cuneiform. Ancient Egyptians and Phoenicians traded down the Red Sea, and even Malay sailors reached Madagascar in the first millennium BCE. Now, the Malay sailors reached East Africa, used the regular wind patterns of the monsoons in the Indian Ocean, and this allowed for fairly easy and consistent travel. And while there has been had been local maritime trade in the Indian Ocean for any unknown amount of time, by the first millennium BC, the Malay sailors began to make those long-distance travels across the ocean. And they brought various crops like bananas and coconuts all the way to East Africa. And there are still various cultural traces of these Malay voyagers in Africa. Now, the tempo, or the pace, of commerce increased in the early centuries CE with greater understanding of monsoons. We're at weaving the web of an Indian Ocean world, sorry. The Roman merchants settled in South Asia and even the East African coast. And there were new technologies like sails, junks, rudders, and keels, even the astrolabe, and evolving versions of the magnetic compass. And the development of these new technologies for shipbuilding and navigation allowed sailors from various locations around the Indian Ocean to engage in some long-distance seagoing trade. And these technologies were very important. It gave more stability to a lot of the ships, and that way they could make those long-distance travels. India became the fulcrum of trade, and thanks to both its central geographic location and its vibrant economy, it naturally became the fulcrum of trade in the Indian Ocean basin. And what encouraged Indian Ocean exchange was the impact of China. The economic revival of the Tang and Sung dynasties gave a huge economic boost to the Indian Ocean trade. And China produced a variety of goods for export to the rest of the world, increasing the volume of trade on these routes. And China had also served as a market for a variety of Indian and Southeast Asian goods. And the rise and spread of Islam and other foreign religious ideas. The rise of Islam also had a positive impact on trade for several reasons. First of all, as the Prophet Muhammad had been a merchant, he served as a positive role model for other merchants. And that's, if you remember, in contrast to China, where the merchants were deemed to be of dubious moral quality. They were not highly looked upon. And second, as the realm of Islam expanded rapidly, it created a single political system that incorporated a number of different economic centers. And that single political system followed the laws of Islam. And in the Indian Ocean, Islam created an international maritime culture. So you can see the importance of Islam during the Indian Ocean trade and its lasting impact. Okay, I thought I'd give you guys some pictures here of what an astrolabe looks like. This one, I believe, is a Syrian astrolabe. Oh gosh, maybe the 1200s or so. It was really hard to find one from the beginning of this time period, 500 to 1500, but I did find one from the 13th century. And in case you didn't know what a keel was, I wanted to show you what keels were. These things right here along the bottom of the boat, and they provided stability when making those long distance travels. Of course, they couldn't go too far close to the coast because of how far down these things go, and they could hit rocks and the earth on the bottom, so they couldn't go too close up to the coast. But they did provide some major stability. Okay. I've got a map here. It shows the monsoon winds, in case you were wondering. April, September, through September monsoons brings in the warm, moist air and dumps it on South Asia. It's very wet and humid. I'm in India during the summer months. And then the winds that come off of the Himalayas, which you know are right here, actually a little bit further north than that. So November through February is the cold, drier air. And so they could use these winds in the Indian Ocean for travel. And it was something they'd used for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the trade routes followed these monsoon winds, so they were very important. And then, of course, in red, you can see the different trade routes, all the way from the South China Sea to the Arabian Sea. We talked about the Red Sea, or we'll talk about it here in a little bit. And this is what I was talking about earlier with the Southeast Asians making it all the way to Madagascar in East Africa. And we'll talk about some of these city-states here along Eastern Africa. This gives you a good idea of what's going on in this part of the world, and then you can see where we're talking about from the outset up here. Okay, sea roads as a catalyst for change. First, we're going to look at Southeast Asia. The ocean trade really transformed Southeast Asia and East Africa. It stimulated political change. There's the introduction of foreign religious ideas. In Southeast Asia, the location was very important because it's between China and India in terms of water travel. And so its location was very important. And this is where the Malay sailors come in, and they open the sea route through the Strait of Malacca about 350. So just at the beginning of this time period of international trade. And they had some small competing ports that really attracted traders. Alright, the Malay kingdom of Srivijaya emerged from the competition as the dominant player in the trade network from about 670 to 1025. They traded goods like gold, spices. They placed taxes on ship and provided resources to create a state there. And the inland states with rice production also participated. And this is in another part of Southeast Asia. And this is kind of around the mainland. You can see modern day where we're talking about here. And I've got another map too that you'll be able to look at. Srivijaya, it's a Sumatra-based kingdom, owed its power to the control over this flow of trade. It's what really provided the resources to create this state, and access to all kinds of goods, and even taxing those ships passing through was really the crucial point in trade between the Indian Ocean and East Asia, and became a fabulously wealthy and very cosmopolitan place. Now these inland states, Funan, about 0 to 600, this is where it's part of modern Vietnam and eastern Cambodia. They hosted merchants from India and China. The Khmer Kingdom of Angkor, 800 to 1300, they exported exotic forest products. And this really attracted a lot of Chinese merchants. And Champa, which is also another part of modern Vietnam, they actually tried controlling trade between China and Southeast Asia, and this provoked warfare. But the Khmer Kingdom of Angkor, this is centered in what is now Cambodia. The state had a strong agricultural base, but also traded the forest products found within their kingdom with the Chinese and Indian merchants. Okay, Indian culture spread to Southeast Asia through trade. The Chinese culture spread to Vietnam. Things like the Indian alphabets, artistic styles, agricultural styles, political and religious ideas, especially Buddhism. And the Cilindrius Kingdom, which is in central Java, was heavily influenced by India. Massive building of Hindu and Buddhist centers in this 300-year period, the 8th and 10th centuries, 7, 8, 900s. And there's a lot of evidence of Buddhist culture in many of the Javanese customs. The Borobudur in Angkor Wat. The Borobudur, and I've got a picture of it that I'll show you, is really the first, or one of the first massive Buddhist monuments in Java. It was built by the Cilindria dynasty. There are 3 miles of walkways telling the stories of the lives of the Buddha. And they're actually set in Java, not India. And Angkor Wat is one of the many Khmer monuments, in case you forgot. Angkor Wat is in this one. It's a Hindu temple, and their central tower symbolized the cosmological center of the universe. Okay, here's the map that I was telling you about. It should be pretty helpful in understanding where a lot of these were located. You can see the Khmer Empire right here. This is what is now actually part of Myanmar now, and then Cambodia. Champa, which is present-day Vietnam. Then we have Srivijaya. This is the, excuse me, not the brown part. That's the part that I was talking about in Southeast Asia. And over here is Cylindria. And there, Borobudur, that's the first one that I was talking about. And I've got a picture of it that's on the next slide. It's really neat. This gives you a good idea of what we're talking about. And so hopefully now you can understand why these particular well, not empires, but kingdoms were so important with the trade between China and India, which is way over here, because you have to take this water route to get there. And to go even further on to, up into the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea, and then East Africa. And here's that monument that I was talking about, Borobudur. It's a vast Buddhist monument. Consists of 6 square platforms. Right, and they're topped by these 3 circular platforms right here. And it gives it a height of easily more than 100 feet. And, I mean, gosh, look at how small the people are. Right? The people right here, they're tiny. So this thing is huge. It's decorated with all kinds of different things. And what might be, or what many be considered Buddhist statues. So what does its location, right, because I told you it's where it is, what does its location tell us about the accelerating connections between India and Southeast Asia? Okay, hopefully you remember, right, where it's located, here on the island of Java. Located in central Java, it's one of the main islands in present-day Indonesia. And Buddhist beliefs traveled southward from India through trade and commerce across the Indian Ocean. And the monument was probably built, many believe, in the 9th century. And it spoke of the interest of the Cylindria rulers in Buddhist concepts like karma and even their own self-perception of god kings. But it's a beautiful structure and a great aerial picture. Okay, sea roads as a catalyst for change in Southeast Asia. Hinduism in Southeast Asia, especially in Champa and Angkor, is important. And we see the development of Indianization in Southeast Asia. And it was a voluntary process, and it's because of the strong economic, religious, and cultural influences from South Asia. Many scholars once spoke of a process of the Indianization of Southeast Asia. While the impact of India is undeniable, we shouldn't overstate this process, as Southeast Asian cultures blended imports from India with their own ideas and traditions and practices. For example, Southeast Asian women had many more opportunities than those in South Asia. So that's where we see this mix of traditional practices, or even existing alongside the new Indian ideas and practices. There's very little conflict, and like I said, it was less patriarchal than those in South Asia. And Islam penetrated parts of Southeast Asia, but that came later. Okay, the sea roads as a catalyst for change in East Africa. The Swahili Civilization developed from the Bantu with the commercial life of the Indian Ocean, especially the Islamic part. This was a civilization of coastal East Africa, and while they were of Bantu descent, they created a whole new identity thanks to their participation in the Indian Ocean trade networks. There was an increased demand for East African products like gold and ivory and quartz and leopard skins and slaves and iron and wood. And a lot of these were luxurious items. Wood that's probably one of those bulk goods that's not necessarily a luxury item, but definitely gold, ivory, quartz, leopard skin, slaves. Those are definitely highly sought after and considered luxury goods. Just a little side note here: when you list many items like this, each one of these would be considered evidence. So that's a piece of evidence, 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 and so on. And it's always better to be specific and name what those luxury items are. You'd rather put gold and slaves and spices and leopard skins as opposed to just saying luxury items. That's where you need to be specific. And like I said, each one of those is a piece of evidence. So that's how if you think about it, it's really easy to get 12 pieces of evidence. And the African merchant class developed because of the Indian Ocean trade with towns and kingships. Now, with the rise of Islamic trade, the Swahili coast had traded with merchants from the north for centuries. Those would be the Islamic traders. But the rise of Islam marked a dramatic turning point in the region's fortunes. And that's because the Swahili merchants began to export those goods and sometimes the slaves of the African interior. And they transported them to the markets of India, Southeast Asia, and China. And conversely, they imported the goods like the luxurious Indian gold art and even Chinese porcelain, right? Fine china. And that's what made them so... they became very wealthy. And they flourished from about 1000 to 1500. And they were more urban. They had a lot of cities of 15,000, 18,000. Some are maybe even around 20,000 people. Great examples are Lamu, Mombasa, Kilwa, and Sofala. And the Swahili culture was a very urban culture, composing of these independent city-states. And despite a common language and culture, there was no political unity. So they were politically independent and each ruled by a king. And these societies had an intense social stratification between the elites and the commoners. Sharp class distinctions existed here. And like I said, they accumulated their goods from the interior and then traded them for the Asian goods that they wanted or needed and didn't have. And most trade was done in Arab ships. Swahili craft really just traveled along the coastal waterways. And this is all part of the rise of Islamic trade as well. Now, the Swahili had a deep participation in the Indian Ocean world. There were regular visits by Arab, Indian, and Persian merchants. Some even settled in East Africa and just stayed there permanently. And some of those Swahili cities were home to a rich fusion of various cultures. The Swahili language, for example, is of Bantu origin, but it uses Arabic script and has many Arabic loanwords. I think that is just fascinating because it sounds, and it's from the Bantu language family, but it uses an Arabic script form for its sounds in its written form. And I think that's just fascinating. And there are some words borrowed from Arabic that they use. And there's a widespread conversion of people to Islam. And that's where we see the cultural fusion of Muslim Africans. And with the spread of Islam, the east coast of Africa was home to a rather large population of Muslims. And they didn't trace their roots back to the Arabian Peninsula. But they did see themselves as a part of the larger Islamic community. And as Muslims, they saw fellow black Africans who did not practice Islam even as outsiders. That's how tight-knit the Islamic community was. They felt that they had more in common with Arabs and Persians than the Africans who participated in those animism religions. Now, the Islam and the Swahili culture didn't reach beyond the coast until the 19th century. They traded with the interior, and that had a major impact. And that trade for gold led to the emergence of what many call Great Zimbabwe. The Swahili merchants forged links with the peoples of the interior of the continent, even as well as further south. And to the south and inland from the coast was this impressive kingdom of Great Zimbabwe. Large stone buildings at its capital, indicating a lot of wealth and some highly organized social classes. Okay, and here is our map. Give you guys an idea. Here's the Great Zimbabwe culture that I told you about. And so follows one of the cities that I mentioned, Kilwa, Mombasa, Lamu. Some of you maybe even heard of Mogadishu, Malindi, Zanzibar, right here, this little tiny island. But this gives you a good idea. Hopefully you recognize this as the Horn of Africa. Right, and here's Madagascar out here. So, Lake Victoria, right here. Right, as we get into this part, especially the further south that you go, it's greener, more humid. It's not as dry as up here, and even on the Horn of Africa, which can be kind of dry, despite the higher elevations. But that is the sea roads exchange across the Indian Ocean. Hope you enjoyed it and you learned a lot.